I'm going to say both good morning and good afternoon because Charles Anthony Silvestri is in the Midwest somewhere, and Christopher
Kansas.
Tin is in California, Santa Monica, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
So my name is Chris Kember. I'm a co-founder of Chromatica, which is a chorus in the East Bay in California. And we are delighted and honored to have the opportunity to perform the premiere of a wonderful piece written by Christopher Tin with lyrics by Charles Anthony Silvestri. We are enormously excited to do this and absolutely love the piece. We've been rehearsing it now for, I guess, a couple of months, and we're beginning to feel faintly comfortable with it, although we have to expose it to Christopher on Sunday afternoon, which is very alarming. Hopefully we won't horrify him. So let me then introduce Charles Anthony Silvestri, who is the lyricist, a very well-known poet who has written, as far as I can tell, for practically every significant modern choral composer, and has written unusually in Latin. There are very few current lyricists who write in Latin, and Voces Lucis, which we will perform in this concert and have performed before, is in Latin. And then Christopher Tin, a very well-known and Grammy-winning composer, who has the remarkable distinction of being the first composer to win a Grammy for video game music. And you might be amused to know that my 30-year-old neighbor came to the concert where we sang Sogno di Volare and literally fell off his chair when he heard it. He said, "Oh my God, civilization." He had no idea. So that was cool. So really delighted that you have taken the time this morning to talk to us. And we're going to, of course, share this video with the people who come to our concerts and look at our website. And what I'd like to do with your approval is to start with Charles Anthony Silvestri and ask him to talk a little bit about how he came up with this remarkable series of lyrics. And I think of them as poetry, upon which this work is based. So perhaps over to you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Every piece, every commission piece, of course, comes together in a different way. But I always try to begin in the same way with a long, deep conversation with the composer that I'm going to be working with. I want to know from the composer what sort of language they're going to use, what kind of sound world are they hoping to create, what might be the emotional journey that the audience is going to go on during this piece. And this is a long work, a multi-movement work. And so, you know, the texts have to hit different kind of themes. But is the climax going to be a dark climax, or is it going to be a bright climax? Those sorts of things are part of that conversation. And in this particular case, we had been given by Chromatica a document of reflections and life lessons learned, containing a whole bunch of interesting raw material. And so part of Chris and my initial conversation was to just kind of figure out what we can use as inspiration from that original document in order to satisfy the commission brief, but also to create something entirely new, entirely ourselves. I apologize in advance if you hear my cat. My cats pay no attention to me unless I'm on a Zoom, and then they cannot get enough of me. So Bandit's in the room here somewhere, meowing. So yeah, so we latched onto this idea of transfiguration, of transformation. Among the life lessons that we read about in the document that was given to us by Chromatica was this idea that life happens, and the more you're attached to the way it's supposed to happen, the more suffering you're going to experience. And so a lot of these texts highlight the inevitability of change, and the pain that comes when we attach ourselves to outcomes. It's very Buddhist sort of in its philosophy, just sort of right on the surface. But you can see that thread running through mythology, running through scripture, running through legends, poetry, Chris and my own thinking about things. And so I tried to find several different, let's call them facets of the same gem, or doorways into a place of change, of transfiguration. And yeah, so I latched on to, of course, the biblical story of the Transfiguration on the Mount. It's the most famous, and the word transfiguration is usually associated with that event, that particular passage from Scripture. And so there's a movement called Yeshua, which is sort of my poetic take on the Transfiguration moment. And by calling it Transfigurations, it allows folks to bring their own theology to it. And I think that always happens. Audiences and choirs will bring their theology to a piece of poetry and to a piece of music. And so to introduce the story from Ovid of Iphis and the poem by Shelley, Ozymandias, I wrote a kind of prelude to Ozymandias, as the great king is about to dedicate his massive statue that we read about later in the Shelley poem. All of these different ways of looking at change and its effect on humans. And then there's a scientific movement too, called photon, about the transformation that energy undertakes. When it is born in the heart of a star, it becomes light. It travels across billions and billions of miles to enter our atmosphere as light, and then it's undergone its transformation, and then plants and living beings take that light and turn it back into energy in their own systems. That kind of transformation is amazing. And then the piece at the end, Tat Tvam Asi, is based on Tagore's Gitanjali, one particular passage from Gitanjali that really spoke to both of us. And it's about that thing that you want to change into. You're already that. So don't stress about it. You are already this being that you want to be. And so there's the inevitability of change, but then also the needlessness of it, right? To focus on it. So approaching that same idea from a variety of perspectives gave me the freedom to write a whole bunch of different kind of poetry. I know Chris loves to set more metrical, rhymed, structured poems, strophic poems, and so I gave him a little bit of free verse and then mostly structured poem. But we talked about that, the kind of format that he was hoping for. Because in a large work, I want to be able to give the composer different textures, different, musical language to work with. And then we sort of wrapped it all up at the very end of the process with a prologue. So it's sort of weird to start at put the beginning at the end, but hey, that's the way Transfiguration works. And in a way, the prologue as the last piece allowed me to craft a text that wove together many of the themes of the later movements, and kind of wrap everything up with a nice bow.
So you recently sent us new text for the prologue because we had been practicing with a different text.
Yeah.
And I think I said to you before we started this conversation that was enormously helpful to us in terms of wrapping the piece together. I talked to you about the piece having a narrative arc, and you were surprised at that.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I really was mindful of during my process of writing a 6-movement work was to give Christopher the freedom to order these movements in whatever way musically would be necessary. I didn't really have any attachment to how the narrative arc was to progress. Where is he going to put the Yeshua movement? Where does Ozymandias go? And so on. I don't know what's going to happen during the compositional process and what key relationships are going to happen and how things need, a fast movement and then a slow. You don't want all the slow movements together and so on. And so I kind of allowed myself to be not attached to the order of things. And then once that order became fixed, then writing the prologue at the end allowed me to be able to kind of, it's the presentation movement. Think of a large meal. A multi-movement work is a meal, and it has multiple courses. Well, the prologue is, what does the restaurant look like when you walk in? How is the table set? What are the things that give you clues about what's to come in this adventure, the culinary adventure that you're about to have? So it kind of allowed me to correct the randomness of my process by making it seem more intentional. And it makes me chuckle when you say that there's this grand arc that only is made possible after the fact. I
Interesting.
think part of the creative process is not really knowing how things are going to work themselves out. You just have to trust.
Sure. I have a question which is kind of bizarre, I suppose, but in Ifis, and by the way, the music in Ifis is absolutely glorious. Uh, you make reference to a phrase called "the well of loneliness," and to me, that is the title of a 1920s novel by somebody called Radcliffe Hall. Is that where
Yeah.
you got that from?
It's intentional. Yeah. For Ifis, I did some research about poetry of um, transgender identity and gay literature. I'd been doing a lot of research and reading of my own about being gay in historical settings. Um, and I asked a lesbian friend of mine, what are the texts in that context that are the kind of core texts of gender identity and sexual identity? And so, yeah, I'd always do a little bit of research. My main profession is a historian,
Mhm.
and so my sort of default setting is to hit the books when I'm trying to write something, especially something that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. Um, I'm a classicist, a medievalist, and so Ovid was familiar to me, but I wanted to make sure that I got the details right. And I love putting little Easter eggs in my poetry like that. As many little things as I can. Just who knows? Maybe the composer will latch on to those little Easter eggs, and it'll become a musical moment. But if there's enough of them there, then uh, it sparks awakening and understanding and that recognition uh, in somebody. But yeah, that was an intentional reference.
Well, that's very good because I grew up as an English major, and that hit me immediately when I saw that phrase. I don't think anybody else in the chorus had ever heard it, but it's kind of fascinating. Perhaps then we should move on to Christopher and ask him how you approach this from a composing point of view.
Well, first of all, I'll say that Easter egg went way over my head, so I totally missed out on that one. And I was actually an English major as well, but perhaps I was the least accomplished of us,
Oh
in
no, no, I'm sure
I
that's not true.
might say. But I was, my two degrees were in music and English, and certainly one of them was more of my main focus. But one of the reasons I do like working with Tony so much is because I have a shared interest in history and literature and things like this. And while I don't catch every reference he throws onto the page, I do enjoy the ones that I do catch. I think early on, when Tony and I connected on this. And let me preface by saying Tony's thus far the only living poet I've ever actually set music to. Yeah, actually. It's very I have not worked with living lyricists, poets, librettists thus far. So it was a different process for me as well. Um, I think early on we had this call, and Tony, you said something like, okay, what do you think of mythology? Yes or no? And I said, yes. What do you think of Americana? I said, maybe not for this one. Sacred or secular? It was almost like a multiple choice, like a get to know you questionnaire that you put forward to me. And in going through the answers and discussing shared interests of ours, that's I think how we came to this suite, which is in parts very sort of historical or mythological in a way. And actually, what's also interesting is that, yes, Tony, you did give me a bunch of poems that you were sort of like unconcerned with the order of, but I think I naturally gravitated towards the order that I think that you were sort of thinking as well, certainly for certain movements like Tatvamasi.
Right. It needs to be the end. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt like it needed to be the end. And actually, another contender for the end was the Yeshua movement. Actually, with all the text that you gave me, the one that immediately jumped and started writing itself in my mind was Yeshua. And my initial instinct was putting Yeshua last, but then Tatvamasi felt like a great coda to Yeshua in a way. So ultimately, I think that I wound up in a place that's not far, I think, from perhaps your initial vision. But I mean, like, there was a lot of flexibility given to me in the process, which allowed me to order things in certain ways that helped me craft a narrative. And what was the cherry on the top of it was, unlike all my previous works where I couldn't exactly say to Emily Dickinson, can you write me a prologue to set this up? In this case, we did have that luxury, and I'm glad that it unfolded the way that it did.
How did you come up with the instrumentation you used? Because it's quite interesting. You have an oboe, you have a double bass, you have a cello, and of course the piano. That's an interesting combination of instruments.
It is an interesting combination of instruments. You know, when it comes down to it, I'm searching for a sound in a way. And the sound that I have in mind blends the instruments and the voices together in a way where I don't think they fight each other. I mean, one of my things about a lot of choral repertory that's voices and piano is that I find, to my sensibilities anyway, the piano and the choir sort of fight each other in a way. You know, the sound of the piano, you know, the rhythmic, recurrent, percussive nature of it. Unless you're writing a piece where it's rhythmic, the vocals are rhythmic and sort of emphatic in a way, I find that the two worlds do not gel well in my ears. And I also want to get away from sort of the romantic arpeggiated based, you know, sort of piano accompaniment that you find a lot. And I was looking for a combination of instruments that gave me maximum flexibility in certain ways and yet had the ability to sort of ease into the sound of the singing. Like, I didn't want the piano to fight the vocals at all. I wanted it to blend in a way. And so the way that I wrote for the piano is very soft, actually. It's not very insistent. It's sort of, it pulses a little bit, you know, it urges on the choir, but it's not in all places like just this steady sort of rhythmic thing that, you know, carries the piece. It's more sort of supplemental. And in a way, that's because of the texts. I mean, if the texts were something a little more aggressive, you know, then perhaps I would have written a different piece, especially regarding the instruments. But as it was, I wanted to create a sound world that sort of reflected what I was feeling with the text. That's something that's a little more introspective in a way. And that's why it's written the way it is. It is a very unusual combination of instruments. And I'm interested to hear how it sounds, actually. I mean, that's the thing about a new piece of music, right? Like, Tony and I can write it. It looks great on paper. And then once you get into rehearsal, you might think, oh goodness, this was not what I had initially imagined. And there is often, fortunately, a process whereby we can collaborate with the ensemble that commissioned it, and we can sort of workshop it a little bit. So I'm curious to see how my instrumentation choices have played out.
So unfortunately, on Sunday afternoon, you won't have instruments. You'll just have the chorus and a piano. With regard to your point about the piano, my sense is that a song like, for example, Sogno di Volare, for all that I have heard it recorded with a full orchestra, actually does work fairly well with the piano because of the points you made about it being rhythmic and yeah, and we have a wonderful pianist who absolutely loves playing that piece. So fascinating.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, though, when you approach a piece, like if you want to think, you know, Sogno di Volare was written as an orchestra and chorus piece. That is a very different task than writing primarily a choral driven piece. You know, with Sogno di Volare, there is no need even for the choir to sing everything. You know, like there's no need to flesh out the harmonies in a lot of ways. I mean, it's the workload is shared by the orchestra and the choir, and you know, like when you compose it, you balance the two so that the sonic space, the gestures, and you know, what each group is doing, the vocals or the orchestra, are meant to complement each other and lock together like a puzzle, right? And that's a different sort of creative approach than writing something like this. early on writing something like this, I didn't even know what the instrumental ensemble would be. I thought for a while, well, maybe this will be just like a cappella even. But then, as we went into it, I started introducing some instruments and then really sort of doing the soul searching as to what combination of instruments I wanted to experiment with a little bit. Because with each commission, there's, just like a little bit of pushing the boundaries of my own writing a little bit. So,
Sure.
yeah.
There are sequences in the piece, particularly in Ifis, but actually in other parts too, where the choral writing is absolutely beautiful, and particularly the upper voices in Ifis, particularly the first part of Ifis, really remind me of somebody you may not be aware of, but I have a close friend in England who is a composer called Cecilia McDowell. Have you ever come across her?
Absolutely.
She writes in a somewhat similar way for upper voices, and what you have done here is really absolutely lovely. And I'm sitting mute, of course, because the first part of that movement doesn't involve male voices at all, and I'm just listening to this beautiful combination of the upper voices in harmonies that are really quite lovely. So I don't know how you pulled that off, but it's really beautiful.
Oh, well, thanks. um, Well, I mean, the reason why it's just upper voices, of course, in that movement is because the movement itself tells the story from the Metamorphoses, whereby Iphis transforms from a girl to a boy.
Mhm.
And so I do it's kind of the obvious thing. Let's be real here. I have the song sung by women in the first half and then men by the second half, and then they kind of combine for a big finale at the end. But
Yeah, no, it's beautifully done. I guess in the mythology, Iphis transforms into a boy or into a man the night before his wedding, which is slightly different from the way it comes out in the piece, but it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, and I included a little epigram, I guess, a quote from Ovid. The vow that he made as a girl, Iphis fulfilled as a boy.
Yes.
Sort of an interesting one line that encapsulates the entire movement. I focused on Iphis. There are many stories of transfiguration, of course, in the Metamorphoses, but many of them involve sexual violence or violent coercive transformations, and this one not only was gentle, but it also spoke to transgender identity, and there aren't a lot of pieces that speak to that. And I thought of, so shining a little light on this one particular passage from Ovid. Yeah, if this the story goes that the father said, if you get to the mother, if you give birth to a girl, I'm going to kill the baby. But if you give birth to a boy, then everything's okay. So she gives birth to a girl and then immediately tells the father, oh, I had a son. And so this ruse has to be maintained. And of course, as dutiful parents, a marriage is arranged for their quote unquote son. And Iphis is actually in love with this girl that she/he has been betrothed to, and she makes this betrothal vow and then feels very deeply that she can't fulfill this vow, and at some point it's going to be revealed, and so she prays to Isis, and the goddess Isis makes it all okay in the end. There's another wonderful story from ancient Rome, the Metamorphosis by Apuleius, where a young wizard who's not very good sneaks into his master's library and tries a spell that it's way beyond his ability, and he ends up mistakenly turning himself into a donkey. And then the novel is all his misadventures as a donkey, but then finally he just can't stand it anymore, and he's going to kill himself by walking into the ocean. I mean, how could a donkey commit suicide other than to drown himself? And Isis, it once again appears. I think that's an interesting theme, that in two different works of Roman literature, it's this Egyptian goddess Isis that intervenes to affect an important transformation. So anyway, I kind of geeked out about all that kind of stuff in my research process. But
That sounds absolutely fascinating, actually.
Tony, can you talk a little bit about what you did metrically at the end of that poem too?
yeah, I chose a particular regular meter and rhyme, which is what I strove for in most of the movements. But then as the transformation occurs, I'm adding more syllables to the line and changing from one meter to another. I think I had watched a video. There's a video of gosh, I think it's Harry Connick Jr. The audience gets clapping on the 1 and 3 instead of on the 2 and 4, and he brilliantly transforms the piece. He takes it out of meter and then back into meter again to correct the audience misclapping. And it's that sort of thing. So the meter clunks there as Iphis is transformed in, and then the final couple of lines are in a different meter. As a person's life changes so dramatically, their natural rhythm of the spring in their step is going to be different. The stride is going to be a little longer. So yeah, there's, again, that's a little Easter egg that, you know, looking at it on the page, you might not recognize it, but hopefully hearing it in the music and embodying it in your performance will sort of shine the light on that change.
I absolutely love the concept of Easter eggs. I think that's such a lovely idea. Were there some musical Easter eggs in your composition, Chris?
Well, that was one of them. I mean, you know, so I, of course, went with Tony's idea, and I changed up the meter in that one spot, you know, where where the transformation is complete. And now Iphis is essentially walking with a longer stride because Iphis is now a boy, right? So now the meter has changed to a triplet meter, whereas kind of a duplet meter before. And that triplet meter is basically a foreshadowing of the Yeshua movement as well, the way it's like these rising triplet patterns, right? So there are little things like that that I do. I'll let you all figure out the rest of them, but I mean, yes, I love doing this sort of thing as well. If for no other reason, you may not even notice that there are little leitmotivic connections between things, but structurally it lends cohesion to the
Yes, indeed. Yes.
and I do like things to be cohesive.
I think what a lyric poet does, at least what I do, is I try to embed as many of these Easter eggs or color words or whatever in the poetry, just to give this composer, you know, underhand softball pitches, words like whisper or silence or rising or dream, things like that, that are words that are impregnated with musical ability and musical possibilities. Little internal rhymes every once in a while, rather than a more obvious end of the line rhyme. The last word of one line, the beginning word of the next line, just to give little moments, you know, little possibilities, tools in the toolbox, as it were, that I can present to the composer if they choose to use it. You know, I can write a sonnet and the composer can do something through compose where the listener might not even know that there are metrical rhyming couplets in it at all. Or you can write something like a hymn or a carol that really that highlights the structure of the text. And so I try to put as much structure and as much music into my poetry as possible, just to make the composer's job easier.
But you do write poetry that's not set to music.
Actually, no.
Oh, I thought you did.
I've amassed this corpus of work, and it's basically all poetry that I wrote specifically for composers to set for chorus. A few years ago, I was approached to have a book of my poetry, and I balked and I said, well, A, nobody wants to read my poetry, and B, there's not enough of it to make a book. And my friend just said, hey, just put all your poems in a Word document and let's see. So I just put all the poems that I'd written for 100 different composers over the years into a document, and it was 200 and some pages long. So I mean, I've just been having fun writing for composers. As a singer myself, as a chorister, you know, I want to contribute to this world that's given me so much, and I'm honored to have this sort of background role in the creation of so many pieces. But no, I often get asked this question. I don't sit at a coffee house with a beret on and take out my journal and write poetry just for myself. I really find the need to serve a composer. I find that when I'm writing something for someone else, then the creativity flows. But if I'm just writing for myself, then I get blocked. I get stuck. And so, yeah.
Chris, did you sing as a child?
I did. I was persuaded to join choir in high school because the girl said, you'll meet girls in choir, so join choir, and that's all it took. I mean, it wasn't my initial impulse, like singing choral music or being involved in writing choral music, but I latched onto it late in high school, all through college. I directed vocal ensembles, and gosh, almost everything I write nowadays features a voice of some sort, whether it's choral, operatic, or otherwise. So it's very much my world now.
I ask because when I joined a choir, I did not have the opportunity to meet girls because it was a Winchester Cathedral choir and I was 7 years old. But it is an absolutely wonderful musical training because, for 5 years, you're singing, I don't know, 20 hours a week. And you really do get quite a musical education. But no girls, unfortunately.
Well, they're a little distracting anyway to, a teenage.
Well, true. Well,
Oh,
true. Yeah.
There are
So,
girls now in many of those cathedral programs, right?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I believe that a couple of cathedrals in England now include girls in their choirs, which of course historically never happened. But and I keep on trying to instruct people that there's no such thing as a boy soprano. The trebles. Can't be a soprano if you're a boy. At least that's what I was taught. I believe it's true. So, how are you doing with Turandot?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's gone great. I mean, the score has been handed in. For those of you who don't know, I have a commission at the moment to to complete Puccini's final opera Turandot, which he died before he could finish the opera, and various endings have been written over the last 100 years. And people have had complaints about all the different attempts at finishing Puccini. So now I get to be the next one that people complain about. And the rehearsals have started. I just got a text from the chorus at the Washington National Opera last night saying we're super excited for this, looking forward to meeting you. So it seems to be going well. It was a real learning process in that, first of all, I've never written for opera before. So there's certain things, okay, there are a lot of things actually that are just brand new to me that are pitfalls that I just was not aware of. One of them, which I had no way of gauging, was the issue of stamina, singer's stamina, right? By the time you get to the portion that I've composed, the soloists have already been singing for 2 hours, and Puccini makes them do some exceptionally insane things, like Turandot herself at the end of Act 2 has to sing a high C over an entire chorus and orchestra playing fortissimo.
Oh, God.
So she's doing this for a couple hours, and then I come along and give her more stuff to do. And what I didn't really have a sense of was just how wiped out are you by the end of the opera. And so the latest round of edits that I did were to write some ossia parts, like, okay, if you've just killed yourself because this is the last of the shows in this run and your voice is tired, here's a lower section. Here's the same melody rewritten so that it can sit a little lower in your voice to give you a little bit of relaxation, a moment to rest. Things like that I never really thought of before, especially writing choral music. Also the way that Puccini writes for his choruses. We had a quick chat before the call about bass parts, for example. And in the choral finale of my Turandot, I don't have the bassist singing bass notes in the same way that a chorus, like a choir, will have you holding down the roots, the lowest tones, right? It's a lot of have everyone sing in the uppermost portion of their voice
Oh, I
because
would love you.
holding down the bottom end, right? There's
Yeah.
a whole lot of bottom end coming from the orchestra. We're going to give you guys the chance to sing something high up. And that's something that I'm starting to incorporate more into my own choral writing. This idea that maybe we can break free from the tyranny of SATB parts where the bass writing by necessity has to hold down the fundamental or, like a chord tone.
Mhm.
I'm trying to find ways to make the bass part as interesting as every other part, and actually elevate all of the interest of all of the parts so that it's just kind of fun to sing.
Mhm.
Like, I'm starting to get there with this piece that we've written for you, Transfigurations. I'm trying to explore ways to make it so it's not just like the sopranos get the melody all the time, like I just want to find ways to create interest for everyone. Because I believe in writing music that listeners want to listen to and enjoy listening to, and two, that the singers and instrumentalists like to play. And I feel like if you could nail those two things, then you've got a pretty good piece on your hands. And right now, I'm working on the second of those two, finding more and more ways to write things that will be fun for every singer to sing. And it's not just like the altos are like, oh, we're gonna fill in the middle note of a chord or whatever. It's just like let's give everyone a moment if we can. And I'm working on that. And
Well,
transfer.
you've been very successful with this piece, because as somebody who's been singing for, well, a lifetime, but not bass, because I've slid down over the years, as one does. Um, there are pieces I sing and I'm thinking, really? I'm holding this low note for page after page and it's boring. It's just boring. And it must be somewhat boring to the listener, but it's sure as heck boring to the singer. So I really appreciate that. That's very helpful.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I've certainly written those pieces myself, right? And sometimes it just comes with the nature of what the piece needs to be.
Yeah.
But also, like, if I can free every voice from the tyranny of what their voice is expected to be, even better.
Oh, I love
Put
that.
that on a t-shirt.
I know, all right? Free the voices, free the basses.
I love that. That's really wonderful. Tony, have you done any more recent writing in Latin like Voces Lucis?
But yeah, Voces Lucis was one of the early ones. In fact, my entry into writing for choir was Lux Arumque, which I wrote for Eric Whitaker.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He had this English text and wanted to render it in Latin, and so I approached it as a kind of scholarly favor for a good friend. And what I didn't realize I was doing in choosing Latin words that not only are an effective and defendable translation of the original text, but also singable. I mean, Latin, it's hard to get Latin wrong in terms of what's singable. It's all very wonderful musical vowels. But there are some words that are crunchy and some words that are a little bit more singable. And Eric said, I want ums at the end of every line. And I said, well, Latin doesn't work that way. You can't just make every word an word.
Yeah.
And so I was working on, without knowing that I was working on it, I was working on writing lyric poetry. But I'm apparently the guy that will write original Latin poetry for a composer. If they don't want the baggage of scripture, if they haven't yet discovered the wealth of classical literature that's out there, and they want a specific text with those wonderful vowels, then I'm the guy. I find it really fun. Sometimes I approach these things like a puzzle, and English, writing a poem in English to certain specifications is a challenge, but writing it in Latin is like a Rubik's cube with a quantum crossword puzzle attached to it, and it's just a really, really fun puzzle to do.
Yeah.
To do it to existing music, that adds yet another layer of complexity and fun. And those sorts of creative boxes really unlock my creativity. Chris, I don't know if it's like that for you. If you are limited in what you can do, your creativity explodes, or do you like the freedom of the blank page to do whatever it is your heart tells you to do?
I actually like the freedom of the blank page. I mean, in a way, the more external factors that get placed on something in advance, the more, in a way, I get distracted by those external factors. I mean, I really, I approach things kind of the opposite way that you do. I think, Tony, you had mentioned something like you tend to write best on spec in a way. If you have a prompt or like a commission or something
Yeah.
like that. I actually do best when you just let me write. And I do best when I get to um, just like follow my heart's desire or my brain's desire or whatever. Just dive out there, do things, construct things. Sometimes I don't even know where a piece is going to go. Like when I start on it, I just dive in anywhere and do something. Um, I have a very different creative approach than I think a lot of other contemporary composers who like to structure things right from the outset.
Yeah.
They'll map out how a piece is going to go. I'm more get in there, write something, do those four bars stick for you? Well, then what's a great companion set of 4 bars to go after that? And it's a very, I don't want to say chaotic, but it's not necessarily a path that I follow.
Yeah.
It's
It's not
very,
linear.
it's certainly not linear. I mean, like, I think with this piece, I started at the end with well, not Tat Pharmacy. I started with Yeshua and then sort of worked forward in a way, which turned out I actually started right in the middle of the ending that I was supposed to write, and I sort of worked outwards. Sometimes I write from the start and I go to the end. I mean, it's sort of like I don't want to like box in a moment of inspiration in a way. I want the inspiration to hit or to be manufactured and then be assigned later on. I want to worry about the details later on. I want to focus on, making little magical moments and not care about where they fit in the bigger picture yet. I'd rather come up with something, set it aside, say, okay, well, we'll sort all of this out later. And
Well, how then do you reconcile the ticking clock of a commissioned work where you've got a premiere date and you can't be too loosey-goosey about waiting for that inspiration?
well, inspiration is not a hard thing actually to come up with. I mean, it just happens. And if like, I sort of said this before, you manufacture inspiration sometimes. I mean, the reason I do it in this chaotic way is because of that ticking clock idea. And the clock is always ticking. I've always got 4 or 5 things going on at the same time. And frankly, I don't mind coming up with a musical idea in the complete ether, not even having a text assigned to it or whatever, but setting that aside and thinking, okay, I'll find a way to make this work. But it's this idea of being efficient with your little breakthroughs. Like, put yourself in the position where the most number of moments of inspiration or breakthroughs that you have can be utilized, rather than starting from something and saying, okay, I need to do this with this text. I'm not going to get up until I have come up with something for this text. Like, if it's not happening in the first 30 minutes, I jump to another point and I do something else. Like, there's a choral commission I have now based around a body of literature. And this is a large tome of poems that number over 100, and I can choose any of them that I want. But rather than picking one and just diving in and focusing on that, I have literally grabbed a phrase from, a short list of maybe 30 of these poems, just one page. And I threw them all on this same 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And so I can see these are the 30 random phrases from these 100-something poems that just randomly called out to me. And I'm going to look at this page. And if something jumps out at me, in this particular minute that I am looking at this page, I'm just going to run with that idea. And, then
So you fill up little shoe boxes of things, and then pretty soon you'll see one of them is piling over, and a couple of them need some attention, and you can then work on the larger structure.
kind of, because, built into my own process is this idea of like, okay, if I write something good, I instinctively want to set it aside and move on to something else. And if I still feel good about that thing 3 days later, then great, it's a keeper. If I don't, then move on, right? But I can't stay working on that piece while my subconscious decides for the next 72 hours whether I actually like my initial idea.
Interesting.
I write it, I let the subconscious stew on it while I write other ideas. And then 3 days later, if I'm like, that idea has legs, then, we run with it. But I sort of let my subconscious do a lot of the filtration for me.
Well, that's very inspiring to me to hear you say that. In answer to your earlier question, Chris, about do I write poetry for myself rather than just for composition, if I approached it more like Christopher does, then I might begin to develop a corpus of poems that are just for me. But it's that staring at the blank page with the complete freedom to write whatever it is I have to say about whatever, that's terrifying to me.
That's fascinating. When I was younger, I wrote poetry. I was not a poet, and I'm certainly nowhere near your standard. But I would write something, and I would read it back, and I would think, God, this is absolutely brilliant. And then I would look at it the next day and throw it in the trash. It was awful. I mean, really. And so I've learned my lesson. You know, you don't assume that the first thing you write is any good at all, because it almost certainly isn't. Well, look, this has been absolutely wonderful. You've spent so much time with us, and we really appreciate it. And we, of course, really appreciate Transfigurations. And we can't wait to see the both of you out here at the end of April as we do the premiere, actually twice, Saturday and Sunday. And thank you so, so much, not just for this morning, but for the incredible work that you've done. We're very appreciative.
Well, and thanks to Chromatica for the opportunity to put the two of us together. I've
Well,
wanted to work with Chris for a long time and write for him. And so this gave me that opportunity, and I've met a new friend, and I appreciate that. So I can't wait to see you all.
very good. Thank
Same
you
here.
so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.